Ancestral Pueblo people lived all over the Four Corners area, throughout Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado.
We don't believe that we came across any land bridge. We were always from the Southwest.
It's an amazing combination of very practical understanding of the world they live in with some fairly profound philosophical ideas.
The choices they faced in order to succeed here became narrower and narrower in time.
There were certain things going wrong by 1260. 1280-ish, everybody's gone. Everybody leaves.
We never use the term abandoned simply because, there's people still there. And we always have to have the greatest respect, especially when we're speaking in spiritual terms.
Colorado Experience is made in partnership with History Colorado,
inspiring generations to find wonder and meaning in our past and to engage in creating a better Colorado. HistoryColorado.org.
with funding provided by the University of Denver, celebrating 150 years, the Denver Public Library, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
Our ancestry starts in the Grand Canyon. There was a hole that we called the emergence place. The emergence where Zuni people came from, and Zuni people actually came from the fourth underworld. They made their way up at the calling of the Sun Father. The Sun Father was calling his children to join him from the surface world. And so they answered that calling by climbing the different types of trees into the next world or levels that we came out of until we were able to reach the surface world. But the bright light was very blinding, so it took some time for their eyes to adjust to that. And when they did, they saw themselves being covered with moss, and they had tails, and they had webbed hands and webbed feet as well. And actually, the Sun Father had then sent two of his sons, who were stars. They came down from the heavens and corrected their physical appearance to be anatomically the way they are today.
Ancestral Puebloan people have lived in this region probably as far back as you want to go. We tend to think of them as living primarily in Mesa Verde, in the cliff dwellings, but in fact, there was a robust population of villages that were on mesa tops throughout Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, near Cortez, near Moab, all through the Four Corners region, not just concentrated at Mesa Verde.
Well, the landscape that they found when they first arrived in this area is largely the landscape that you see here today: pinyon juniper forest, sage parklands. And it just so happens that this area is prime agricultural area. And so when they became agriculturists and they began growing maize, it must have been a very appealing area to them, because the land, at least in this part of the Mesa Verde region, is weatheral loam. It's very deep, it's very well drained, and it has excellent moisture retention properties.
Ancestral Pueblo people were the first farmers in Colorado. And by about 800 BCE, Ancestral Puebloans were farming in the dryland regions and along the rivers of southwestern Colorado.
It looks like they were growing corn, beans, and squash primarily, although they also supplemented that diet with a number of wild food resources, things like chenopodium and amaranth.
Mushrooms, beeweed for spinach, and different collection of herbs that we had. All had seasonal times.
They understood the cycle of the seasons in a way that they knew the best time to plant. They followed the stars. They were advanced astronomers. But of course, they were very savvy about using water.
Water mostly it comes from precipitation. There's enough water in 16 inches of water a year to support the kind of vegetation that you see here. And they used a number of different strategies to, number one, get domestic water, and number two, have enough water precipitation-wise to make their crops successful.
Water is life for us, and water is also things that we also controlled in the past in a way of diverting or in a way of collecting fresh water sources.
Mesa Verde is deceptive because it looks like a very dry environment by and large. But what the Ancestral Puebloan did was to combine an acute understanding of the landscape and all of its resources, its water resources, with technologies to capture and conserve those resources, and an overall strategy, in a sense, that was built on an understanding of the seasonal variation in water and really how to use it most effectively throughout the year.
They used a number of really clever methods to maximize precipitation on their crops. They built check dams, and what the check dams were designed to do was to spread water out. If you build a check dam across a shallow arroyo and you want to plant your crops in that area, you build a check dam with stones across a little drainage, and as the water comes down, then it backs up after a rain. So it does two good things. It waters whatever is there already. If you've already planted crops, what it also does is it allows the water to stop long enough to drop its sediment out. So you're actually building these little farming terraces everywhere you build these check dams.
These were the earliest irrigation works in Colorado, and some of them were so expertly engineered that later settlers who came in the 1800s simply cleared out the weeds from Ancestral Pueblo and ditches and dams and began using them again as if nobody had left.
Virtually every small drainage into canyons was used as part of that agricultural effort. And if you multiply that by not just a few, but by dozens and dozens and dozens of field systems of this nature spread throughout the landscape, you're talking about a fairly large-scale agricultural effort. Still using very limited types of tools, digging sticks, hoe-like tools, very, very minimal in that regard, but very effective when put in the hands of somebody who's as skilled as an Ancestral Puebloan farmer.
As dryland farmers, they were arguably the most successful farmers Colorado has ever seen, succeeding in farming for more than 2,000 years.
But precipitation isn't enough for ancient peoples to live here. They needed a domestic water source. That was the primary thing that they had to have. Water to drink, water to cook with, water to wash with, water to make pottery with, water to mix with mud to make mortar or adobe. And if you're as savvy about the landscape as the Ancestral Pueblo people were, they knew how to find springs. For one thing, they would look at the vegetation that's growing. Cattails, a dead giveaway. The huge cottonwood tree behind me is a dead giveaway. Any place they saw deciduous vegetation, they would know, okay, there's water under there somewhere.
Springs are very important in not just for their presence or anything like that, but it's also a way we map the landscape. We know every springs there is to know. I mean, after all, there's nothing that's piped or anything like that. It's just a natural springs. We make sure we incorporate that into our prayers, into our songs, and at the end of our prayer, we actually put our hands in the spring itself and look towards the direction of where Zuni is. And we sprinkle it 4 times like that to have that water, the spirit of the water, reach Zuni.
The communities in the open areas like this pulled together and built their villages right on the springs up at Mesa Verde. A lot of the springs were in the alcoves. A lot of those really large cliff alcoves had seeps in the back. And so that was actually an added inducement to moving down off the mesas, building in a very protected area. And then you also have your water source right in your village, which must have been very convenient.
Although they didn't have a lot of volume, they could be managed very carefully. Collecting all the water from a series of seeps in the back of an alcove by pecking little channels, tiny little channels in the bedrock to a cupule about 6 inches deep and maybe 4 inches in diameter. That collected enough water for domestic consumption for a day or thereabouts. This site also has essentially a cistern, a masonry cistern that was constructed, and it's just around the corner from where we stand now.
So it looks like, based on the archaeological evidence we have, that people would channel runoff across the top of the slick rock to these pour-offs, and water from that pour-off would actually fill this masonry-lined cistern below.
That captured a fairly substantial amount of water as it came over the ledge and down as a waterfall.
Pueblo people used a variety of vessels in their everyday life. It really looks like for the collection and storage of water, they often used jars. And these would be large vessels with generally a restricted orifice at the top, or at least some narrowing near the top, so that you could collect water and it wouldn't be splashing out as it would in a bowl.
Pots could have been placed under pour-offs, little waterfalls, and we still find some of those in place in a place like Mesa Verde, just set in place. Somebody never came back to it. It's still there, filling up with water periodically and drying out. So all of that comes down to, an extensive array of water resources. They knew how to conserve it. They knew how to, as I said, capture it, distribute it, use it for both their personal needs as well as at times facilitate crop growth and things of that nature. This is a population that used water in a very different way than we do today.
The ancestral Pueblo people had 2 different kinds of domesticated animals. Dogs, which had been domesticated for many, many centuries before the ancestral Pueblo people were here, but they also had domesticated turkeys.
Turkeys were really valuable to the Pueblo people as a way of augmenting their protein intake. A diet that's heavily reliant on corn, beans, and squash has a few deficiencies if those are the only crops that you're eating. One of those is protein. Turkeys provide a lot of that protein, and through the process of domestication, you could make it more certain that you would have available protein to supplement that corn-based diet.
In the summertime, I think there would have been dogs and turkeys and kids running around. It would have been, I think, a very noisy place filled with perhaps songs and laughter and people playing flutes, and perhaps noise from somebody shaping a rock to build a new structure. There would have been the smell of cooking fires in the air. The men might be out hunting. By the time they occupied this village, probably most of the deer had already been hunted out, but there were still plenty of cottontail rabbits. Rabbits were always on the landscape. I think the women always spent a lot of time with meal preparation and food processing. They would have spent a lot of time grinding maize. They would have spent a lot of time preparing meals. The younger children perhaps were out gathering firewood. Every meal that had to be heated up or cooked, there had to be wood in the fireplace to fuel that fire.
It was a real skilled managed system that they had. So everybody. It took the entire village to have a role and responsibilities of what they do. We have the medicinal groups, then we have the Kachina groups. At one point, we had a person who was referred to as the sun watcher or the caretaker of the sun, and this different astronomical roles that other different groups had as well. Very, very complex. And then to have the farming and have the understanding of having our subsistence of how we're supposed to all live together.
What we typically see here at Mesa Verde are what we call courtyard complexes. And those are the primary living spaces for an extended family. They are comprised of a series of structures, generally linked together, contiguous structures. And really the centerpiece of these little courtyard complexes were the kivas. The kivas consisted of a round structure, some quite small, some quite large, some shallow, some very, very deep. So there was some variability. But invariably, the kivas were placed in sort of the central position in the courtyard complex.
The only way into a kiva was through the roof hatchway, and so even if it was built above ground on slick rock, it would seem like it was still underground because you have to go up on the roof and go down a ladder to get inside the kiva.
Each kiva has a hole. It's not very large. It's usually about 4 inches in diameter, thereabout. And that feature is the point of entry into the earlier worlds. It's a point of connectivity between the past and the present, and to a certain extent even the future.
It still has features of being underground as it relates to a lot of our beliefs about that, and the use of the ladder to exit from the rooftop was always in place. That goes to our beginnings of our emergence and the understandings of that as well too.
By about 1100, the Four Corners area saw its peak of population. Areas around Cortez and Durango had a higher population density than they do today in the 21st century.
That population may have been in the range of 30,000 people, one of the largest communities anywhere in this part of North America at that time.
Of course, the landscape that ancestral Pueblo people moved into was a land of abundance with game and timber. But all of those people created extreme pressures on the resources and on the landscape. By 1100 AD, most of the game had been hunted out of the Four Corners area. The deer that had for so long been the stable protein of the ancestral Pueblo people was harder and harder to find. Timber had been completely removed from the Four Corners area to build houses and for fuel and firewood. Archaeologists today talk about the tyranny of the turkeys, these rather unpleasant, foul, dirty animals that the ancestral Puebloans had to coddle and take care of, who ate their corn, who drank their water, but who were absolutely necessary in order to survive. And one of the challenges that ancestral Puebloans faced over time was that they were victims of their own success. As the populations became larger, as ancestral Puebloans put more pressure on the landscape and on the environment, as they overhunted the deer and cut down all of the trees, the choices they faced in order to succeed here became narrower and narrower in time.
There were a series of droughts in southwestern Colorado through time. In the mid-1100s, there was a really severe drought that seems to have affected society on a very large scale. Around AD 900, there was another period of really dry weather. The one that gets talked about the most is the Great Drought that occurred in the late 1200s.
It was pretty abrupt, it was pretty severe, and it lasted until 1299. The acute problem was food, was the crops.
And because corn is such a major part of the Pueblo lifestyle in terms of their economy, in terms of what people ate every day, any shortfalls in that production, particularly with a large population living on the landscape, would have a number of problematic effects.
It was bad enough, and the population was so high that it might have just been that final straw, that final grain of sand on the pile of sand that causes the whole thing to collapse.
What affected their economy in terms of the crops that they could grow. Perhaps question some of the social order that was in place at the time in terms of who's in power and how that power was legitimized. It would have really had a wide-ranging impact on how people thought about themselves and their communities.
There were certain things going wrong by 1260 because probably by 1260 some people had already started migrating from the area, and the rest of the people were moving into alcoves at Mesa Verde, building cliff dwellings, very defensive structures.
Those beautiful cliff dwellings that we think of as the epitome of ancestral Pueblo culture today really represent a period of fragility and instability. You move off of the mesa tops where you can farm down into the cliffs for security, to protect yourself.
Other communities were building places like Goodman Point, Pueblo, that had walls right on top of their springs. Sand Canyon, Pueblo, a few miles to the west, built their village right on top of a spring, walled village. So people were gathering together, hunkering down, and people generally don't do that if everything is going wonderfully.
During the period in the 1100s and early 1200s, a lot of these large cliff dwellings had towers constructed in them. At times they were positioned in such a fashion that it suggests that they were used as either lookout towers, a place of refuge, a special place within the community. These upper ledges, and you'll see this time after time after time. The access was difficult, oftentimes only by ladder, and then the ladders could be pulled up, and so it provided some protection for members of that community.
There's quite a lot of evidence that the last thing that happened at Goodman Point, at Sand Canyon, at Castle Rock, the very last thing that happened was a violent event in which many villagers were killed. Even up at Mesa Verde, there's some evidence in the cliff dwellings that the very last thing that happened was a violent event. So many of these really beautiful, huge, multi-storied masonry villages were occupied for 15 or 20 years, and they would not have left if they could have possibly figured out a way to get through yet another drought. But 1280-ish, everybody's gone. Everybody leaves.
The depopulation of southwestern Colorado in the late 1200s has really been of interest to a lot of folks for a very long time. Often it gets spoken about in terms of mysterious disappearance of people and how could that have happened and where did they go. The precise social and environmental reasons for that are a little bit complicated, obviously.
Drought, is one of the biggest things that everybody points to. But what about the groundwaters? They can also be contaminated. What if the water went bad within a whole area? That would give us a reason to move.
There may have been other factors that were playing a role as well. As these communities invested more and more and more in their agricultural technologies in that overall effort, they were also becoming aware of other areas of the Southwest that had other types of technologies that were related to irrigation systems and things of that nature. They were looking for more sustainable locations at that point. So it's a combination of push, some of the issues going on with the local environment, the climate history, the population size, and just some pulls to these other areas.
Their disappearance is far from mysterious. The ancestral Pueblo people adapted to the changing environmental conditions that they faced in about 1200 AD, and they consequently moved to New Mexico, to the Rio Grande in particular, where they had more reliable access to water. The Pueblo people today who live in New Mexico and Arizona are descendants of the ancestral Puebloans who lived in Colorado 1,000 years ago.
I think that all of that should be kept in mind with the present Puebloan views that they can return to this place that this is still a part of their effective environment, their world, and that they've never really left. They left all sorts of things in place to come back to.
We never use the term abandoned simply because, there's people still there. And that system existed for thousands of years in that area.
Archaeology has a lot to teach us in terms of the way people living in southwestern Colorado harnessed and used water resources. They understood the land. They understood what the impacts of specific constructions would be. That detailed understanding not only of the needs of the community, but in terms of what was possible from the local topography and environment.
That's what I take away from it, that very thoughtful understanding of the landscape and its resources, combined with their ability to innovate. They inhabited this place. They really used it in a very creative and very practical way. And so they're a remarkable group of people.
I think these folks did a pretty good job. I think a lot of people did see the writing on the wall and left, but the folks that stayed behind thinking they might be able to weather it, they didn't take a good gamble, they didn't take a good risk, it didn't work out for them. So today I think we want to be sure we're not in the camp of maybe it won't turn out so bad, maybe in the future it'll turn out okay. We can't afford to do that. We can't afford to do that anymore.
And a lot of times that involves education of our own people, not just from our cultural past, but in modern day to understand how much water is actually being used and how it's used.
Life here can be very good if you're careful and respectful of the resources you have. But in times of scarcity, we have to make hard decisions about how we live in places like Colorado. The ancestral Pueblo people give us a lesson in how those kinds of decisions can play out over time.
People really valued water in the West in general, and I think the Pueblo people were no exception to that. You can see it in a lot of their social organization, the reverence, this complex reverence for water that they've developed over millennia. So I think a little bit of that reverence, a little bit of that appreciation would serve us well too.